"Hey, I've got you. We're U.S. Navy. You're safe." The woman tied to that chair lifted her head, and there was no fear in her eyes. That was the first wrong thing. The second came half a second later. Her fingers moved against Master Chief Gideon Voss's forearm. 3 taps, pause, 2 taps, pause, 1. Every operator in his unit knew that pattern. It wasn't panic. It wasn't reflex. It was a contact signal, taught in exactly one kind of training pipeline. Confirm friendly, confirm compromised, confirm silence required. Voss's hands went still on the zip tie, because the woman they'd flown 600 miles into the Montana, dark to rescue, wasn't a hostage at all. "I put myself in that chair, Master Chief," she said later, standing in the rain, 3 weeks ago, on purpose. And behind her steady eyes waited a secret 15 years buried. One that would tear open everything the Navy thought it knew about a man they'd already mourned.
Rain on the Sound. Not hard, just enough to blur the sodium lights over Naval Base Kitsap into long orange smears on wet asphalt. Master Chief Gideon Voss stood at the window of the operations building with a coffee he wasn't drinking. Cold now. He didn't care. Because something about tonight already felt wrong, which was strange, since nothing had happened yet. The knock came at 11:40, not a polite knock, a summons. "Voss!" Commander Whitfield didn't wait to be invited in. "We have a situation." "We always have a situation. Not like this one." He set a folder on the table, slid it forward, didn't blink. Voss opened it. Satellite imagery, grainy, green-tinted, a compound tucked into the folds of a mountain range he recognized immediately. Bitterroot, Montana. "Private facility," Whitfield said. "Registered as a corporate retreat and training center, Thorne's Sentinel Group." "Never heard of it." "You're not supposed to have." Voss looked up, waited. 6 hours ago we picked up a distress signal, encrypted, buried under 3 layers of civilian traffic so deep our systems almost missed it entirely. Whitfield tapped the image. A structure near the tree line. A shape inside, barely visible through the thermal wash. 1 occupant, female, restrained, alive. American? That's the assumption. Assumption's not a fact, sir. No, it's not. Silence sat between them like a third person in the room. Voss studied the thermal blur again. Small frame, curled inward. The kind of stillness that wasn't sleep. "Get your team," Whitfield said. "Wheels up in 90. "That's it?" No name, no agency, no explanation for why a civilian retreat in Montana has someone tied up in a back room. That's it. Because sometimes that was all you got. And sometimes that was the whole point. Voss didn't ask again. He'd learned that lesson a long time ago in places he didn't talk about anymore, under skies that weren't this one. You didn't always get the why. You got the coordinates, you got the clock, and you moved. He closed the folder. 90 minutes, he said. Team will be ready in 60. Whitfield turned to leave, stopped at the door. Voss, sir. Whatever you find in that room, whoever she is, a pause longer than it needed to be, bring her home. That's the plan. I didn't ask about the plan. The door closed behind him before Voss could answer that, which was fine, because he didn't have an answer, not one that made sense yet. He stood alone in the empty office a moment longer, coffee gone cold in his hand, rain ticking against the window glass. 22 years in this uniform, enough rescues to lose count of the faces, and still, some nights carried a weight the others didn't. Some folders sat heavier in the hand before you even opened them. This one had barely left his fingers, and already it felt like a stone in his chest. He thought briefly about calling his ex-wife, about telling her he'd be gone again, unreachable for however long this took. Then he thought better of it. Some habits from a marriage that hadn't survived this life were harder to unlearn than others, and picking up a phone to explain an absence to someone who'd stopped expecting explanations years ago felt like reopening a wound neither of them needed reopened tonight. Instead, he set the coffee down untouched and walked toward the TOC because whatever waited in that concrete room in Montana, it wasn't going to wait on his personal reckonings to sort themselves out first. The Tactical Operations Center smelled like burnt coffee and cold electronics. 4 men stood around the table when Voss walked in, Duran, their youngest, already tapping his knee under the table like his body couldn't hold still with what was coming. Reyna, quiet, watching the screen the way he watched everything, like it might bite him if he blinked. Halverson, the old bear of the group, arms crossed, unreadable, and Cobb running comms checks that didn't need running because his hands needed a job. "Talk to me," Halverson said without looking up. Voss pulled the imagery onto the main screen. Let it breathe there a second before he spoke. "Private compound, Thorne Sentinel Group, registered corporate retreat, licensed training facility, all paperwork clean." A pause. Too clean. And buried under it, we picked up a distress ping. One live body, restrained, no ID. Duran leaned forward. "So we don't know who she is?" "No. We don't know why she's there." "No. We don't know if this is a hostage situation or a setup." "No, Duran, we don't." The kid sat back, exhaled through his nose. "Great. Love that for us." Reyna hadn't said a word yet. He rarely did until the picture was clear enough to speak into. Now he leaned in, studied the structure's layout, the tree line, the single road cutting through the property like a scar. "One road in," he said, "one road out. That's not a retreat. That's a choke point." "Agreed." Which means whoever built it wasn't thinking about liability insurance. Also agreed. Halverson finally looked up. "You said the ping was buried? Encrypted?" 3 layers deep. "Corporate retreats don't encrypt distress signals 3 layers deep, Chief." "No," Voss said. "They don't." Because that detail had been sitting in his chest since Whitfield handed him the folder. A hostage didn't smuggle out a signal like that. Not without training. Not without knowing exactly what frequency to hide it under and exactly how long the window would stay open before someone noticed. Which meant one of two things. Either somebody very good had taught her how to do that, or she'd already known. He didn't say that part out loud. Not yet. No use building a theory on a shadow and a signal ghost. Better to walk in with open eyes and let the compound tell them the truth on its own terms. Nobody moved right away, because 40 minutes was nothing, and everybody in that room knew it, and everybody in that room had learned a long time ago that the countdown always started before you felt ready for it. Duran was first to break. Pushed back from the table, rolled his neck until it cracked. "Anybody else think this smells like a setup?" "Everything smells like a setup," Halverson said, "until it doesn't." "That's not comforting, old man. Wasn't meant to be." Cobb was already halfway to the equipment cage, headset looped around his neck, muttering frequencies under his breath like a prayer he'd said 1,000 times before. Reyna lingered longest at the screen, eyes still tracing the compound's layout, the fence, the single road, the low buildings set apart from the rest, like something the architect hadn't wanted looked at too closely. "Chief?" "Yeah. If she's not a hostage." Reyna didn't look up from the screen. "If she's something else. What's the play?" Voss thought about that. Really thought about it. The way he thought about things that mattered, slow and careful turning it over before he let it out into the air. "The play's the same either way," he said finally. "We get eyes on, we assess, we bring her out breathing. Everything else gets sorted after that. And if she doesn't want to come out, then we have a longer conversation on the way to the aircraft." Reyna almost smiled at that. "Almost. Copy that. Gear up," Voss said. "We wheels up in 40. The flight in was loud enough to drown thought, which Voss was grateful for, because his mind kept snagging on the same small detail. The way the figure in the thermal image had been curled, not slumped, not collapsed, curled the way you curl when you're conserving heat, conserving energy. The way you curl when part of you is still working the problem even while your body waits. Hostages didn't usually curl like that. Survivors did. He set the thought aside, unresolved, closed his eyes for the last 20 minutes of the flight, though sleep never came. Just the old rhythm of engine noise and rotor wash, and underneath it the quieter rhythm of his own pulse, counting down toward a door he hadn't opened yet. They dropped 2 clicks out. let the aircraft peel away into the dark before the real work started. Montana at 3 in the morning was a different kind of quiet. Not silence. Never silence out here. Wind moving through lodgepole pine. Somewhere distant, water over rock. The mountain breathing in its sleep. Voss raised a fist. The team went still behind him, 5 shapes folding into the tree line like they'd never been there at all. Rayna's voice barely more than breath in his ear. "Camera at your 2 o'clock, 40 meters. "Copy." They moved, because that was the job. Not thinking, not yet, just moving boot over root weight rolled heel to toe, silent as the trees around them, until the compound's fence line came into view through Voss's optics, a dark seam stitched across the mountainside. Guard posts, 2 visible, probably 2 more they couldn't see yet. Cameras. Motion triggered from the look of the housing. And behind the fence, low buildings, arranged with a precision that had nothing to do with hospitality and everything to do with control. "This isn't a retreat," Duran muttered. "No," Voss said. "It's a cage." Somewhere behind them the wind shifted, carrying the faint metallic tang of a generator running someplace underground, a sound that had no business belonging to a corporate training facility. Voss filed the detail away without comment, the way he filed away every small wrongness that didn't yet add up to a whole picture, trusting that the picture would eventually assemble itself, whether he pushed for it or not. It usually did, just rarely on the timeline anyone wanted. Inside the low building at the edge of the compound, Sloane Calloway sat very still in the dark and counted her own heartbeats, because counting was the only thing left that still belonged to her. 71 hours since a signal jammer glitched during a routine sweep, and 2 guards found her exactly where she hadn't wanted to be found. 48 since the questions had stopped and the silence started, which was worse because silence meant they were deciding something without her in the room. She'd trained for this. Not this exact chair, not this exact concrete, but the shape of it, the waiting, the not knowing. Her grandfather's voice surfaced sometimes in the long stretches between footsteps outside the door, patient low, the same voice that had corrected her stance on a dock at first light 15 years ago, back when she was 11 and furious that her arms weren't long enough to hold a rifle properly. Panic is a choice, Sloane. Same as calm is. Pick the one that keeps you alive. So she picked calm. Picked it over and over every time Boots passed outside the door, and didn't stop every time she heard a radio crackle and couldn't make out the words, every time her arms went numb from the ties and her mind went looking for reasons to be afraid instead. She didn't know help was coming. Had no way of knowing the encrypted signal she'd buried 3 layers deep during her last window of freedom had actually surfaced somewhere in a naval operations center 600 miles away. For all she knew, that signal had died in the noise, unheard, one more failed attempt in a night full of them. But she kept counting anyway, kept her spine straight in the chair, even when her body begged her to slump. Kept her mind moving through the ledgers she'd memorized during 3 weeks of careful, patient work inside this compound. The names, the numbers, rehearsing them silently so they wouldn't slip loose from memory the way things slipped loose when fear took over. Thorne. Nathaniel Thorne. A name she'd learned to hate. Slowly, methodically, the way you learn to hate a splinter you can't quite reach. And somewhere beneath that hatred, quieter, more dangerous, a hope she hadn't let herself examine too closely, because if Thorne was still protecting something after 15 years, still spending money and men and silence to guard whatever secret lived behind that unassuming fence line, then maybe the official story had been wrong all along. Maybe there wasn't a grave at the bottom of it. Maybe there was a man. She thought, too, about the 4 months it had taken to build the identity that got her through Thorne's Sentinel Group's front doors in the first place. Anna Whitcomb, a corporate compliance auditor with a spotless resume and a manufactured employment history that had taken a small army of favors and long nights to construct. 4 months of careful groundwork before she ever set foot in that lobby. 3 weeks of careful movement once she was inside it, and then, in the space of 4 seconds, all of it undone by a single glitching transmitter. She'd been 3 days from finding proof, 3 days from finally understanding what happened in that room where her grandfather's name had last appeared on any official record, when the jammer failed and 2 guards found her exactly where she hadn't wanted to be found. They hadn't asked questions, just tied her to a chair and left her there, as if waiting for someone to decide what she was worth. Which meant somebody, somewhere in that compound already suspected exactly who she really was. And that meant her window had just slammed shut. 3 weeks of careful work reduced to whatever she could carry out in her memory, and the desperate signal she'd managed to bury under civilian frequencies with the last working transmitter she had left. She'd been turning that hope over and over like a stone in her palm when the door finally opened, and light from a flashlight swept across the floor, and a voice she didn't recognize said the words she'd almost stopped believing she'd ever hear. "U.S. Navy, you're safe." She'd looked up, measured him in half a second the way her training had taught her to measure everyone. Steady hands, controlled breathing, a man who'd done this before many times in rooms far worse than this one. And she'd made a decision in that same half second, the only decision that mattered, now that the door was open and the countdown had finally started for real. She would trust him enough to get out. But not enough to tell him everything. Not yet. Getting through the fence took 11 minutes. Getting past the first guard post took 4. Halverson handled that one himself, quiet and quick, the kind of quiet that didn't leave witnesses awake to talk about it later. Voss went low along the wire, counting seconds the way he'd counted seconds since he was 22 years old, and still believed counting was the same thing as control. 12, 13, 14. Because counting kept the mind busy, because a busy mind didn't wander toward all the ways a night like this could go wrong. And there were always ways. Which was the whole problem with rooms like the one they were walking toward. You never knew which way until you'd already opened the door. Duran came up on his 6, breathing, controlled boots silent on wet pine needles. "Cameras are on a 60-second sweep," he murmured. "We've got maybe 12 seconds of blind window at the corner post." "Copy, 12 seconds. "That's not a lot, Chief. It's what we've got." They moved. 12 seconds became 8 the moment they actually started counting them for real, the way seconds always shrank the instant they mattered. And they cleared the corner post with Rayna's shoulder brushing the fence hard enough to draw a sharp breath through Voss's teeth before they were through, and into the tree shadow on the other side. Cobb's voice came low in every earpiece at once, monitoring from the aircraft's holding pattern a mile out. "No new movement on the guard towers. You're clear for another 90 seconds before the next sweep." "Copy, Cobb. Moving." Halverson took point through the storage yard, rifle low movements, economical in the way of a man who'd done this so many times the choreography no longer required conscious thought. Voss had served alongside him for 11 years now, long enough to read the set of his shoulders the way other men read weather. Tonight, Halverson's shoulders read wrong, tighter than usual, a half step slower on the turns. "You good?" Voss murmured. "Fine, Chief." "Didn't ask if you were fine, asked if you were good." Halverson didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice had dropped low enough that only Voss caught it. "Something about this compound's layout," he said, "reminds me of a place I walked into once a long time ago that didn't end the way anybody wanted it to." Voss didn't push. Some doors a man opened on his own timeline or not at all. "We'll walk out of this one clean," he said instead. "That's the hope," Halverson said. "Hope's cheap tonight, though." They moved building to building, storage, barracks, empty beds, still made with the kind of precision that suggested nobody had slept in them in a while. A garage with 3 unmarked SUVs and a truck whose plates had been swapped so many times the bolts were stripped. Duran, crouched by the truck's rear tire, ran 2 fingers along the frame, found a compartment welded in where no compartment belonged. "Chief, you need to see this." Voss crossed to him, looked. Rifles. 4 of them, wrapped in oilcloth, serial numbers scraped to nothing. "Corporate retreat," Duran said flat. "Yeah. Sure. Log it, photograph it. We're not here for the rifles." "Feels like we should be here for the rifles. Maybe next trip." Because there was always a next trip in this line of work. You learned that early, too. You closed one door, and somewhere behind it, another one was already creaking open, and the only trick that ever mattered, was learning which doors to walk through tonight and which ones to leave for later. Sealed, marked, remembered. This door tonight had a woman behind it. Everything else could wait. And then at the edge of the compound, half swallowed by shadow, a low building set apart from the others, single door, no windows, the kind of building you put something in when you didn't want it seen. That's it, Raina said. Voss felt it too, that old certainty that lived somewhere below language, the one that had kept him alive through 3 deployments and a dozen rooms just like this one. On me, he said. The door wasn't locked. That detail landed wrong in Voss's gut the second his hand found the handle. Locked doors meant someone was afraid of what might get out. Unlocked doors meant someone wasn't afraid of anything at all. He pushed it open anyway. The room inside was small. Concrete floor, a single bulb throwing yellow light into the corners, and in the center of it, a chair. A woman bound to it, wrists zip-tied behind her back, head down, dark hair falling across her face. Still. Too still. Cover, Voss breathed, and Halverson swung to check the corners while Raina and Duran held the door. Voss crossed the room in 4 steps, knelt, touched 2 fingers to her throat before he touched anything else, because a pulse was the only thing in that room he trusted right now. Strong. Steady. Not the pulse of someone who'd given up. Hey, he said low, I've got you. We're U.S. Navy, you're safe. Her head lifted, slowly, like it cost her something. And when her eyes found his, there was no fear in them. That was the first wrong thing. The second wrong thing came half a second later when he reached to cut the zip ties at her wrists, and her fingers moved. Not flailing, not clumsy with relief the way a real hostage's fingers moved when help finally arrived. Deliberate. 3 taps against his forearm. Pause, 2 taps. Pause, 1. Voss's hands stopped moving on the tie, because he knew that pattern. Every operator in his unit knew that pattern. It wasn't panic. It wasn't reflex. It was a contact signal taught in exactly one kind of training pipeline used to confirm identity and status without a single word spoken aloud, in case the room was wired for sound. 3, 2, 1. Confirm friendly. Confirm compromised. Confirm silence required. He looked at her face again. Really looked. Not at a woman in danger, at a woman running a protocol. She held his eyes and gave the barest shake of her head. Don't react. Not yet. Voss finished cutting the tie like nothing had happened because whatever this was, it wasn't finished revealing itself, and blowing it open in a concrete room 200 yards from armed guards was not how any of this ended well. Can you walk? He asked, voice pitched for the room for whatever ears might be listening. Her voice, when it came, was rough from disuse, cracked at the edges. I can run. Not the answer of a woman who'd been broken. They moved her out fast. Halverson took point. Duran and Raina flanked. Voss stayed close enough to catch her if her legs gave, which they didn't. Not once. Not even when they hit the fence line and had to half vault, half scramble over broken ground in the dark. She kept pace. More than kept pace. She read the terrain half a step ahead of his own instructions, like she already knew which way the ground dropped, like she'd walked this exact stretch of dark before with someone else's voice in her ear. Because she had. He didn't know that yet, not fully, but some old, tired part of him was already assembling the shape of it piece by piece, the way you assemble a shape out of shadows before your eyes adjust enough to name it. Contact. Raina's voice tight. 2 o'clock. Moving. A guard cutting a lazy patrol line along the fence's inner edge, radio crackling faint against his shoulder. Voss raised a hand. Freeze. They went still. All of them. Her too, folding down into the brush without being told, without a sound, her breathing slowing to something almost invisible, which was not what people who'd spent 3 weeks tied to a chair usually knew how to do. The guard passed, kept walking, never turned his head. Voss exhaled, signaled forward. They kept moving. The extraction point was a flat shelf of rock half a click up a dry creek bed, chosen because it was far enough from the compound that rotor noise wouldn't carry and open enough that a bird could set down without clipping a tree. The Black Hawk was 4 minutes out when she stopped walking. Just stopped. Planted her boots in the gravel and didn't move another inch even as Duran turned back and hissed her name, except he didn't have her name. None of them did, and the absence of it sat strange in his mouth. "Ma'am, we need to keep moving. There's something I need to get." Voss turned. "Excuse me. Back at the compound. There's something I need." "We are not going back to the compound. You don't understand." "No," Voss said, and something in his voice cut clean through the dark. The voice of a man who had walked more of his people out of worse places than this one, and buried the ones he couldn't. "You don't understand. In 4 minutes, there is a helicopter landing on this rock and every single one of us is getting on it, including you, because right now, you are the only unknown variable I have not solved, and I am done solving unknowns in the dark." She looked at him. Something moved behind her eyes. Not fear, calculation. "There are men in that building," she said, "who are going to disappear by morning. Documents, names, everything I spent 3 weeks getting close to." Her voice hardened. "If I leave now, I lose it. All of it. And I don't get another 3 weeks. You don't have 3 more minutes," Voss said. "That's the math tonight." "Not the math you wanted. The math you've got." "You don't understand what's in there." "No," he said again, and this time something in his chest ached at the saying of it, because he could see now, clear as the compound had been clear on the thermal feed, exactly how much this woman had already paid to stand on this rock in the dark. "I don't. But I understand what's standing in front of me right now, a person, alive. That's the only variable I'm authorized to protect tonight." Her eyes searched his face. Whatever she found there, it cost her something to accept it. "Okay," she said finally, quiet. "Okay." But she looked back once toward the black shape of the mountain behind them, toward the compound swallowed in trees, and Voss saw it. The look of someone leaving a job unfinished. Not the look of a woman escaping, the look of a woman retreating. The rotor wash hit them 30 seconds before the aircraft did, kicking dust and gravel into a stinging wall, and Voss shoved her toward the open door with a hand between her shoulder blades because whatever she was, whoever she turned out to be right now, she was a body that needed to be airborne and safe before anything else got sorted out. She climbed in without help, found a seat without being shown one, buckled a harness her hands already knew how to find in the dark, in a shaking aircraft without looking down once. Duran caught Voss's eye across the cabin, didn't say anything, didn't have to, because they were both thinking the same thing now. The thing that had been building since the door of that concrete room, since the tap of her fingers against his wrist, since the calm in her eyes that had no business being there. She wasn't a hostage. She was something else entirely. And whatever that something else was, it had just climbed onto their aircraft wearing 3 weeks of captivity like a coat she could take off the second nobody was looking. They didn't ask questions in the air, couldn't over the noise, and wouldn't have anyway, not with Whitfield waiting on the other end of this flight with a debrief room and a folder that was about to get a great deal thicker. Voss watched her instead. She sat with her spine straight, even though exhaustion had carved deep shadows under her eyes. Her hands rested in her lap still, except for one thumb that moved in a slow circle against her palm, over and over. A habit Voss recognized, because he'd seen men do the same thing after firefights. A small motion, to keep the mind tethered to the body. She wasn't looking at any of them. She was looking out the window, down at the dark folds of the mountains falling away beneath the aircraft, at the compound shrinking to a smudge of light, and then to nothing at all. And under the noise of the rotors, Voss thought he saw her lips move. Just once. 2 words, maybe 3, shaped more for herself than for anyone else in that cabin. He didn't ask what they were. Not yet. But something about the shape of her mouth as she said them nagged at him, because he'd seen that shape before. Not on her. On someone else, a long time ago, a face half-remembered from a briefing room slideshow he'd sat through as a green lieutenant who didn't yet understand how heavy some names could get. A set to the mouth like that. A stillness like that. He didn't have the name yet, just the shape of it floating somewhere at the edge of memory, waiting. Sloane, for her part, wasn't thinking about the men across the cabin at all. She was thinking about a lake, about a dock at first light mist still sitting low over gray water, and a voice behind her, patient, low, correcting her stance, 1 inch at a time. Elbow down. Not locked. Never locked. Breathe out halfway. Hold it there. Not all the way empty. Halfway. She'd been 11 the first time her grandfather put a rifle in her hands, and she remembered being furious that her arms weren't long enough, yet furious that the stock sat wrong against her shoulder, furious in the particular white-hot way only an 11-year-old could be furious at her own body for failing her. He'd laughed, not unkindly. "You're not failing, Sloaney. You're 11. Give it time." "I don't want to give it time. Everything worth having takes time. Anybody tells you different, they're selling something." She hadn't understood that then. She understood it now, 15 years and 3 weeks in a locked room later, understood it in a way that sat in her chest like a stone she'd been carrying so long she'd forgotten it had weight at all, because he was supposed to be dead. 15 years. She'd stood at a memorial with no casket in it, had watched her mother's hands shake around a folded flag that felt more like an apology than an honor, had grown up in a house where his name got spoken softly like something that might crack if handled wrong. Training accident. That was the official word. A word that never once in 15 years managed to explain why there was no body, why the file was sealed 3 clearances above what her own mother, a naval officer herself, had ever been permitted to see. Sloane had spent 11 years believing the word, had spent the last 4 refusing to. And 4 months ago, she'd begun building the identity that would carry her into Thorne Sentinel Group's front lobby, because a whisper from an old contact of her grandfather's, a whisper that had cost that contact his life 2 days after he gave it to her, told her that the truth about Emmett Calloway didn't live in a grave in Arlington. It lived behind a fence line in the Bitterroot Mountains. She hadn't found him yet. 3 weeks of careful movement inside those fences, careful silence, careful patience, and she'd found ledgers instead, encrypted drives. A name that made her blood run cold every time she overheard it spoken in the mess hall. Nathaniel Thorne. Her grandfather's old commanding officer. The man half the surviving members of his old unit still spoke of with something between reverence and unease. The man who'd built an empire out of government contracts and quiet influence in the 15 years since Emmett Calloway supposedly died in an accident nobody could produce paperwork for. All of it undone in the space of 4 seconds, the way careful things always seem to unravel faster than they were built. 4 months of manufactured pay stubs and fabricated references of late nights memorizing a biography that wasn't hers until it felt more true than her own. Gone in less time than it took to draw a single breath. She looked out the helicopter window now, watching the mountain fall away into darkness, and felt something twist hard in her chest. Not fear. Grief, maybe? Or something closer to failure? Because she hadn't found him. Whatever he was to that place, proof ghost or something worse, she'd left it behind, unfinished, exactly the way she'd promised herself standing at that empty casket memorial 15 years ago. She would never leave anything about her grandfather unfinished again. The words she'd shaped silently against the cabin noise, the ones Voss had almost caught, hadn't been for him. "I'm coming back for you." She just hadn't decided yet how. Naval Base Kitsap came up out of the dark 40 minutes later, runway lights strung out like a seam of gold thread across black water, and the Black Hawk settled onto the tarmac with a shudder that ran up through the deck plating and into Voss's boots. Whitfield was waiting, alone. No medics standing by, no processing team, which told Voss something else was already in motion, something above his pay grade, something that had started moving the second that encrypted signal chirped through 3 layers of static 6 hours ago. The rotors wound down, the door slid open. Cold air rushed in, carrying the smell of jet fuel and wet concrete, and for a moment, nobody moved. Duran unbuckled his harness slow, like the last 4 hours had only now caught up to his hands. Halverson sat with his eyes closed, lips moving faintly, the way he did after every extraction, a habit none of them had ever asked him about. It was, Voss suspected, some private accounting Halverson kept with himself after every mission that ended without a name added to a list nobody wanted to be on. Reyna watched Sloane instead, watched the way she gathered herself before standing, shoulders squaring, chin lifting, a woman assembling her own composure one piece at a time, like a soldier checking gear before a formation. She stepped out first, on her own, steady on her feet despite 3 weeks of whatever that compound had done to her, and she walked toward Whitfield across the tarmac like she already knew exactly who he was.
"Commander,"
she said. Whitfield went very still. "You know my rank," he said, "but I don't know your name." She stopped a few feet from him, rain misting down now, catching the runway lights, silvering the dark strands of her hair. "Sloane Calloway," she said. "Naval Intelligence." The name landed in the space between them like a dropped weight. Voss watched Whitfield's face for the first time all night lose its careful, practiced stillness. "Calloway," Whitfield repeated very quietly, like the name had teeth. "As in—" "Yes," she said before he could finish. "As in that Calloway." Whitfield's hand came up briefly to rub against his jaw, the gesture of a man doing rapid arithmetic he didn't like the answer to. "Your file said you transferred out of the analyst pool 8 months ago," he said. "Said you'd taken a position with a private contractor doing compliance work. Nobody flagged it as unusual. Nobody was supposed to. You built that cover through official channels. I built that cover through channels that looked official," Sloane said. "There's a difference, Commander. And I imagine you already know exactly which one matters more right now." Behind her, Voss felt Duran shift, felt Halverson go tense the way he did before a room turned into a fight, felt the whole team recalibrating in real time because none of them had a name to hang on that yet. None of them understood what that single word had just detonated in the space between their commander and the woman they'd pulled out of a chair 2 hours ago. But Voss did, or thought he did. A memory surfacing from somewhere buried, an old case file he'd glimpsed once in a briefing room years ago, a name attached to a legend, attached to a disappearance nobody in the community talked about anymore. Emmett Calloway, Force Recon. 15 years gone, officially dead in a training accident nobody had ever seen the paperwork for. Voss looked at Sloane Calloway standing in the rain in front of a man twice her rank, spine straight, chin level, eyes dry despite everything that had clearly just been carved out of her over 3 weeks in a locked room with an unlocked door. And he understood, with the particular cold clarity that came right before everything got complicated, that this had never been a rescue mission at all. It had been the first page of something much older, something that had been waiting 15 years to surface and had chosen tonight, chosen this rain-soaked tarmac, chosen this exhausted young woman standing perfectly still in front of them to finally break the surface of the water. "We need to talk," Whitfield said. "Now, in private." Sloane nodded once. Then she turned just slightly and looked back at Voss, at the team standing behind him, soaked and silent and still trying to reassemble a mission that had stopped making sense somewhere around a concrete room with an unlocked door. "Thank you," she said, quiet, genuine. "For coming." "We didn't have a choice," Voss said. "Distress signal, standard protocol." "No," she said, and something moved behind her eyes again, something old and tired and carrying more weight than a 26-year-old should have to carry alone. "You didn't, but I did." She let that sit a moment. "I put myself in that chair, Master Chief," she said, 3 weeks ago. On purpose." Nobody spoke, because there was nothing left to say that wouldn't sound small against that. The rain kept falling. The runway lights kept burning gold along black water. And somewhere behind Sloane Calloway's steady eyes, a story 15 years in the making waited to finally be told, one piece at a time, to men who had walked into that concrete room expecting to find a victim, and walked out instead, having found the beginning of a war none of them yet understood they'd already joined. They walked her inside under floodlights past a hangar door rolling shut behind them with a sound like distant thunder, and into a debrief room that smelled of industrial carpet and old coffee. A room built for exactly this kind of conversation, and none of the comfort that should have come with it. Whitfield closed the door himself, didn't call for a stenographer, didn't call for anyone. Which told Voss, more than anything else that night, exactly how far above his own clearance this had already climbed. He and his team stood in the corridor outside, out of earshot but not out of sight of the frosted glass, watching two shapes settle into chairs on either side of a table, watching the commander lean forward with his elbows on the table and his hands folded like a man bracing for weather. "You think she'll tell him everything?" Duran asked, quiet. "No," Voss said. "Why not?" "Because she didn't tell us everything either, and we're the ones who pulled her out of that chair." Halverson grunted, crossed his arms, stared at the frosted glass like it might yield something if he looked hard enough. 15 years, he said. "That's a long time to keep a man dead who isn't." "We don't know that's what this is, don't we?" Voss didn't answer that, because some part of him, the part that had spent 2 decades reading rooms and reading silences and reading the particular stillness of people who'd survived things they shouldn't have survived, already believed Halverson was right. Already believed that whatever name Emmett Calloway carried in whatever file was locked 3 clearances above his own, that name wasn't attached to a grave. It was attached to a debt. Duran shifted his weight against the wall, arms crossed, watching the same frosted glass the rest of them watched. "You think Whitfield already knew before tonight?" "Knew what, specifically? That Calloway had a granddaughter running her own operation into a compound we'd never even heard of?" Voss considered that. "I think Whitfield knew a piece of it, enough to send us in fast when the signal surfaced, not enough to have stopped her from getting there in the first place. That's not much of a safety net." "No," Voss agreed. "It isn't. And debts like that didn't stay buried forever." They waited. Patient as mountains, patient as the fence line around a compound built to look like nothing at all, until somebody walked close enough to the edge of them to fall in. Sloane Calloway had walked closer than close. She'd walked in on purpose. Through the glass, Voss watched her hands still folded in her lap the way they'd been folded on the aircraft still, except for that same slow thumb tracing circles against her palm. Watched her spine stay straight, even as whatever Whitfield was saying to her landed heavier and heavier across her shoulders. Watched her nod once, twice. A third time, slower, like the weight of the nod itself had grown too large to lift easily, and then, just before the blinds came down across the glass at Whitfield's hand, Voss saw her look up, past the commander, through the glass, straight at him standing in the corridor with rain still drying in his hair and 3 weeks of somebody else's captivity still clinging to the edges of the room behind her. She didn't smile. There was nothing in that look that resembled comfort. But there was something else there, something that felt for just a moment like recognition, like she'd already decided somewhere in the quiet architecture of her own mind that whatever came next, she would need people like him standing in corridors like this one. The blinds dropped, the glass went white, and Gideon Voss stood in the hallway of a Naval Intelligence building at 4 a.m, soaked to the skin, and understood with total certainty that the mission Whitfield had handed him 90 minutes ago was already over. Whatever came next was something else entirely, something older, something with 15 years of silence behind it, and a mountain range full of secrets still waiting to be walked back into. And somewhere behind that white glass, Sloane Calloway was about to hand a room full of officers a story that would tear open every quiet assumption any of them had ever made about the man they thought they'd lost. Because she hadn't survived that compound. She'd been looking for it. All along. The debrief room held its silence longer than any of them expected. Voss stood in the corridor still 3 hours after the blinds dropped, watching the door instead of the glass now because Whitfield had come out once already, face unreadable, and gone straight to a phone at the far end of the hall without a word to anyone. That kind of silence meant something. It always did. Because officers who had good news walked differently, talked louder. This one had walked like a man carrying something heavy down a long flight of stairs, careful not to drop it, careful not to let anyone see how much it weighed. Voss had seen that walk before. Once, years ago, after a mission that ended with 3 names added to a wall nobody visited enough. He remembered thinking then that some news simply didn't fit through a doorway the normal way. It had to be carried sideways, braced against the frame, lowered, slow. Whitfield was carrying something like that now. Halverson had gone to get coffee nobody wanted an hour ago and still hadn't come back, which told Voss the old man needed the walk more than the coffee. Duran had fallen asleep sitting upright against the wall, chin dropped to his chest, the particular sleep of a man whose body had simply run out of adrenaline to burn. Reyna hadn't moved from his spot by the window in all that time, arms crossed, eyes on the parking lot outside like he expected something to arrive out of the dark. Voss checked his watch, checked it again 4 minutes later, though nothing about the hallway had changed. Because waiting was its own kind of work. Nobody talked about that enough. The waiting that came after the running, after the doors in the dark and the fence lines, the waiting that asked nothing of your body and everything of your mind, because your mind had nowhere left to go except back through everything that had already happened and forward into everything that hadn't yet. He thought about the compound they'd left behind, about the rifles filed to nothing in a hidden compartment, the generator humming somewhere underground that had no business belonging to a corporate retreat. Small wrongnesses that hadn't added up to anything solid yet, but that sat in his chest anyway, waiting their turn to matter. At 05:30, the door finally opened. Sloane came out first, paler than before if that was possible, but steady. Still steady the way she'd been steady on the tarmac, the way she'd been steady in that concrete room with a stranger's hands at her wrists. Whitfield followed a step behind, and his eyes found Voss immediately. "Chief, my office. 5 minutes." "Yes, sir." Sloane didn't look at anyone as she passed. Didn't need to. The set of her shoulders said everything that needed saying, which was nothing, not yet, not out here, in a corridor with too many ears. Whitfield's office was small, government gray, a single window looking out over a runway going pale with early light. He didn't sit. Neither did Voss. "What I'm about to tell you doesn't leave this room," Whitfield said. "Not your team, not your reports. Nowhere." "Understood." "Say it back to me." "It doesn't leave this room, sir." Whitfield exhaled through his nose, rubbed a hand over his face like he was trying to scrub the last 4 hours off his skin. 15 years ago, he said, there was a force recon colonel named Emmett Calloway. You've heard the name? Once, briefing room, years back. Then you know the story. Training accident, no body recovered, case closed, file sealed, everybody moved on. Whitfield's jaw worked. Except it wasn't an accident, and it isn't closed. Voss felt something cold settle low in his stomach, the same feeling he got right before a door came off its hinges wrong. "Sloane Calloway is his granddaughter," Whitfield said. "Naval Intelligence, 26 years old. 4 months ago she began building a false identity to get inside Thorne's Sentinel group because a contact told her the truth about her grandfather's disappearance was buried inside that compound. 3 weeks ago she walked through their front doors under that identity. The contact. Dead, 2 days after he talked to her." Voss said nothing, because there was nothing small enough to say back to that. "She didn't find her grandfather," Whitfield continued. "She found something else. Financial records, personnel files, enough to suggest Thorne Sentinel Group isn't just running a training facility. It's running something considerably worse." "Which is?" "She doesn't know yet. Not the whole shape of it. But she's convinced whatever it is, it connects back to why her grandfather was made to disappear." Whitfield finally sat dropping into his chair like his legs had given out on him. "And she wants back in." Voss stared at him. "Back in?" "Yes." "Into the compound she was just tied to a chair in?" "Yes." "With your authorization?" Whitfield's silence answered that question before his mouth did. "You cannot be serious," Voss said. "I'm dead serious, Chief. Because the alternative is letting whatever's happening inside that fence line keep happening while we sit on our hands protecting a woman who is going to find a way back in with or without us."
That's not protection, that's a leash with no hand on the other end.
"Then you hold the leash," Whitfield said, flat, final. "You and your team escort her. You control the pace, you control the exposure, but she goes back to Voss because she's the only asset we have who's already inside their trust radius, and I am not throwing that away over procedure." Voss looked out the window at the pale runway, at the last of the night burning off the edges of the sky. "She's 26 years old," he said quietly. "So was I, once. So were you." Whitfield's voice softened just slightly. "She didn't ask for this, Chief. Her grandfather's ghost handed it to her. The least we can do is make sure she doesn't have to carry it alone." "And the leak," Voss said, "the one who tipped Thorne's men to flag her audit sweep in the first place. You have a theory on that?" Whitfield's face tightened, the first real crack in his composure all morning. "I have a suspicion. Nothing I can act on yet. Which is exactly why I need you and your team inside that compound with her, not just for the mission, but because I don't yet know who inside my own walls I can trust with the details of it."
That's not reassuring, sir.
"It's not meant to be reassuring," Whitfield said. "It's meant to be honest. I owe you that much, at least." Voss thought about that on the walk back down the corridor. Thought about the particular weight of a name passed down through a family like an inheritance nobody wanted. Thought about the difference between a soldier who chose the fight and a soldier who was born already standing in the middle of one. He'd met men broken by less. Fathers who came home from one deployment and spent the next 30 years fighting a smaller, quieter one in their own kitchens, unable to explain to their children why certain sounds made their hands shake. He wondered what that kind of inheritance did to a person when it skipped a generation and landed instead on a granddaughter who'd never even gotten the chance to ask her grandfather the questions that mattered. 15 years of silence. 15 years of a folded flag standing in for a man who might even now be breathing somewhere under a mountain in Montana. That wasn't inheritance. That was a debt collector who'd been patient too long. They put her in a room 3 doors down. Not a cell, nothing so blunt as that. Just a spare office with a cot nobody had slept on in months, and a window that didn't open because somebody upstairs still wasn't entirely sure what they were dealing with. Voss knocked once, let himself in when she didn't answer because the silence on the other side of that door had a different weight than the silence in the corridor, and he'd learned to trust the difference. She was sitting on the edge of the cot, elbows on her knees, staring at nothing. "You should be asleep," he said. "So should you." "Fair point." She looked up at him. Something in her face had shifted since the tarmac. Less armor, more exhaustion showing through the cracks of it. "He told you," she said, not a question. "He told me. All of it? Enough of it." She nodded slowly, looked back down at her hands. "My grandfather used to say the truth doesn't care how tired you are," she said. "It just waits, patient as anything, until you're ready to go get it." A breath. "I've been ready for 4 years. You've also been tied to a chair for 3 weeks. That's not the same thing as not ready." "No," Voss admitted. "I suppose it isn't." He pulled the room's single chair around and sat across from her close enough that the conversation didn't need to be loud. "Whitfield wants me to take you back in," he said. "I know. You knew before he told me?" "I told him that's the only way this works." She met his eyes. "I'm not asking permission, Master Chief. I'm telling you what has to happen. There's a difference. There's also a difference between conviction and recklessness." "Is there—" Something flashed behind her eyes, quick and sharp, because from where I'm sitting, the only difference anybody's ever drawn between those 2 words is whether the person doing it happened to be a man. Voss didn't have an answer for that. Not one that wouldn't sound hollow the second it left his mouth. "Fair," he said instead. She almost smiled. Almost. "You're allowed to disagree with me, you know," she said. "Everyone else seems to. I don't disagree that you need to go back, but I disagree that you go back alone. or unprotected, or without every single one of us understanding exactly what we're walking into this time. He held her eyes. Last time we walked in blind and found a hostage who wasn't a hostage. I don't intend to walk in blind twice. Something eased in her shoulders just slightly. The first real give he'd seen since the concrete room. She looked down at her hands, then turning them over slowly like she was checking them for damage that wasn't visible on the outside. "Can I tell you something?" she said. "Something I haven't told Whitfield. Something I haven't told anyone." "You don't have to. I know I don't." A breath. "But I think I need to say it out loud to someone who isn't going to write it down in a file." Voss stayed quiet, let her find the words at her own pace, the way he'd learned to do with men fresh off a bad extraction, men whose stories needed room to breathe before they'd come out whole. "The night they tied me to that chair," she said, "I wasn't scared. Not the way you'd think. I was angry, furious, actually, at myself because I'd spent 3 weeks being so careful, so exact, and one glitch in a signal jammer undid all of it in about 4 seconds. Her hands stilled. And somewhere in that anger, underneath it, there was this small, ugly little voice that said, "Good. Now you have an excuse to stop looking. Now you can go home and grieve him properly instead of chasing a ghost through a forest for the rest of your life." But you didn't stop. No. Her eyes came up fierce again and the fire back behind them. Because the second that voice showed up, I hated it more than I've ever hated anything. I realized I'd rather die looking for the truth than live comfortable inside a lie. And I think that's the part of me that scares people, Master Chief. Not the training, not the skill. That. "It doesn't scare me," Voss said. "No, I've met that part of a person before. In myself, actually, more than once." He held her gaze steady. "It's not something to be scared of. It's something to build a plan around." Something in her face shifted then, softened, the smallest crack in the armor she'd been wearing since a runway 3 hours ago. "Okay," she said. "Okay." "Okay, Master Chief. We do this your way. Structure, planning, all of it." A pause. "But we do it fast. Because every hour we spend planning is an hour Thorne has to finish whatever cleanup he already started the second his men realized I wasn't who I said I was." "You think he knows?" "I think," she said, "that nobody keeps a woman tied to a chair for 3 weeks without deciding what she's worth first. And I think that decision doesn't stay small forever." By the time the sun cleared the ridgeline east of the base, the team had reassembled in the same TOC that had felt less than 12 hours earlier like the start of a straightforward rescue. It didn't feel straightforward anymore. Duran had gotten 2 hours of sleep and looked like it. Halverson looked the same as always, which was its own kind of unsettling. Reyna sat with a legal pad in front of him, already sketching the compound's layout from memory, lines and boxes and small careful notes and handwriting too neat for a man who'd been awake all night. Sloane stood at the head of the table, where Voss usually stood, and nobody objected. "Thorne's Sentinel Group isn't a training facility," she said without preamble. "It's a laundering operation for something considerably larger than corporate security contracts. I don't have the whole architecture of it yet. What I have is this." She pulled a folded page from her pocket, worn, soft at the creases from being hidden and unhidden 100 times over 3 weeks. "A partial list. Names. Some of them belong to people I recognize from classified rosters that shouldn't exist anywhere outside of Vault 3 levels above my clearance." She set it on the table. "Which means Thorne has access to something he should not have access to, and I think my grandfather is the reason he has it." "Explain," Halverson said. 15 years ago, my grandfather commanded a unit under Nathaniel Thorne. Something happened on their last operation together. I don't know what yet. But whatever it was, it ended with my grandfather officially dead and Thorne walking away to build an empire that's been quietly absorbing government contracts and classified assets ever since." "You think Thorne set him up?" Voss said. "I think Thorne needed something my grandfather had, and I think when he couldn't get it the easy way, he made sure the official story ended with a funeral nobody could argue with." The room went quiet. "And you think he's still alive?" Durand said, not mocking, careful, like he was handling something breakable. Sloane's jaw tightened just slightly. "I think," she said, "that a man doesn't keep spending 15 years of resources protecting a secret that's already buried. You protect graves you're sure of. You don't need an empire for that." Her voice dropped quieter. "You need an empire for something that's still breathing." Nobody argued with that, because nobody in that room had a better theory. And every single one of them, Voss included, had felt that same cold certainty settle into their chest the moment she said it out loud. Halverson broke the silence first, voice low. 15 years is a long time to keep something breathing that you'd rather the world thought was dead. Takes resources, takes discipline, takes a reason that doesn't go away. "You think you know the reason?" Voss said. "I think," Halverson said, "that men like Thorne don't spend 15 years protecting sentiment, they protect leverage. Whatever your grandfather knows, Sloane Thorne still needs it. That's the only math that explains this kind of patience." Sloane nodded slowly, filing that away with the same careful precision she filed everything else these days. One hard truth at a time, building toward a shape none of them could see completely yet. The plan took shape over the next 6 hours, piece by piece, the way plans always did when the stakes had gotten too heavy for shortcuts. Sloane would go back in under her original cover, a corporate compliance auditor named Anna Whitcomb, the identity she'd spent 4 months building before ever setting foot inside Thorne's lobby 3 weeks ago. The captivity, she argued, actually strengthened the cover rather than weakening it. "They tied me up because my papers glitched during a routine audit sweep," she said, "not because they made me. If I walk back in demanding an explanation, furious about being detained without cause, that's exactly what an actual auditor would do." "Bold," Reyna said. "Necessary," she corrected. Voss's team would insert 2 days behind her, posing as a private contractor security detail brought in to review Thorne Sentinel's own protocols. A cover built, fast and thin, but plausible enough to survive 48 hours of scrutiny if nobody looked too hard. 48 hours, Halverson said. "That's not much runway." "It's what we've got," Voss said, echoing his own words from the night before without realizing it, until they were already out of his mouth. Cobb ran the comms architecture twice, testing frequencies against known jamming patterns Sloane had mapped during her first 3 weeks inside. Durand pored over blueprints pulled from county permit records, hunting for anything resembling the low, windowless building where they'd found her. Halverson spent most of the afternoon quiet studying satellite imagery with the particular patience of a man who'd learned long ago that rushing a plan only guaranteed rushing a funeral later. Twice he flagged discrepancies nobody else had caught, a shadow on the imagery that didn't match the building's known footprint, a vehicle pattern that suggested traffic heavier than the compound's stated purpose should have generated. "You've got a good eye," Sloane told him the second time. "Had 30 years to develop it," Halverson said. "Wish I could say it got easier with practice. Mostly it just gets quieter. You stop needing to say out loud what you're seeing." And through all of it, Sloane sat at the center of the table, calm in a way that unsettled Voss more than panic would have. Because panic he understood, panic he could work with. This was something colder, something that had been building in her for years, long before any of them walked into that concrete room, and was only now finding a shape it could finally move through. Around dusk, Durand finally set down his blueprints and looked across the table at her, the way a much younger brother might look at an older sister he'd only just met, but already trusted with something important. "Can I ask you something?" he said, off the record. "Depends on the question." "Your grandfather, what was he like before all this?" Sloane considered that for a long moment, and something softened in her face, the first softening Voss had seen all day. "Patient," she said finally. "Impossibly patient. He used to say most people rush toward the wrong answer because waiting for the right one feels like losing." A small, tired smile. "He taught me to shoot before he taught me to drive. My mother was furious about the order of operations." Duran laughed, quiet, surprised by his own laughter, given the weight of everything else in the room. Sounds like a good man. He was, Sloane said, then quieter. He is. I have to believe that now. Present tense. I don't know how to do any of this if I don't. Halverson, who rarely offered comfort to anyone, reached over and set a heavy hand briefly on the table near hers, not quite touching, just close enough to be felt. Present tense, he agreed. Until we know different. It wasn't much, but it was something, and Sloane held on to it the way she'd been holding on to small, hard-won things for weeks now, turning it over quietly in her chest, like a stone she meant to keep. Cobb, watching from across the room, offered his own small contribution to the moment without looking up from his equipment. For what it's worth, ma'am, whatever we find down there, this team doesn't leave people behind. Never has. I'm counting on that, Sloane said, more than any of you probably realize. Late that afternoon, an encrypted call came through on the base's secure line routed to Whitfield's office and relayed at Sloane's insistence into the TOC. The voice on the other end belonged to a contact Sloane had cultivated inside Naval records, someone she trusted enough to risk this call, and someone whose voice, the moment it started speaking, made every hair on Voss's arms stand up straight. Sloane, you need to hear this before you go back in. Go ahead. I pulled everything I could on the personnel transfer records from your grandfather's last unit. Most of it's exactly what you'd expect. Redacted, sealed, standard stuff for that era. A pause heavy with something Voss recognized immediately as bad news trying to find its way out. But there's a flag on the file, an access log. Somebody's been pulling that file recently, repeatedly. Who? That's the thing. The access credentials trace back inside Naval Intelligence itself. The room went very still. Say that again, Sloane said very quietly. Somebody inside our own house has been watching this file for months, Sloane. Which means somebody inside our own house already knew you were digging into this before you ever set foot in Montana. Sloane's face didn't change, but her hand, resting flat on the table, curled slowly into a fist. Which means, she said, somebody inside our own house is the reason Thorne's men were waiting for a compliance auditor who shouldn't have raised a single flag. Nobody spoke, because the math was ugly and simple and impossible to argue with. A corporate retreat didn't tie strangers to chairs on instinct. Somebody had to tip them off. Somebody had to know exactly who Anna Whitcomb really was, and exactly which threads not to pull, and exactly when to move before she got too close. We have a leak, Voss said. We have a leak, Sloane repeated, flat, cold. Which means whoever it is already knows I'm still alive. And already knows I'm planning to go back. Then we call this off, Duran said. No, Sloane said, sharp enough to cut the air in the room clean in half. We don't call it off. We find out who it is. Because if there's a mole feeding information to Thorne, that mole doesn't stop the moment I walk away from this. That mole keeps feeding him everything, forever, until somebody finally catches them. Voss watched her and understood, in that moment, something about Sloane Calloway that ran deeper than grief or vengeance, or even the truth about her grandfather. She had already decided a long time ago that she would rather walk into danger with her eyes open than let danger keep circling people she loved with her eyes closed. Okay, Voss said. Then we find the leak first, before we send anybody back through that fence. The archive room at Naval Intelligence headquarters was the kind of place time forgot to modernize. Rows of locked cabinets, a single terminal humming in the corner running software 2 generations out of date. The smell of old paper and older secrets. Sloane moved through it like she'd memorized the layout years before she ever needed to. My mother used to bring me here, she said, quiet, while Voss and Raina worked through boxes at the far end of the room. When I was a kid, she'd tell me it was where the Navy kept its ghosts. Cheerful. She wasn't wrong. Sloane paused at a cabinet drawer, fingers resting on the handle without pulling it open. She still works 2 buildings over from here, you know, Logistics Command. She doesn't know I'm doing any of this. As far as she knows, I took a compliance job with a private contractor because the analyst pool bored me. A short, humorless laugh. She'd never forgive me if she knew how much of this I've built on lies to people I love. She might surprise you. Maybe. Sloane finally pulled the drawer open. Or maybe some truths are kinder as secrets, right up until the moment they aren't anymore. Raina pulled a thick folder from a box marked with a case number that meant nothing to Voss, but clearly meant something to Sloane because her whole body went still the moment she saw it.
That's his unit, she said. She took it from Raina's hands with a care that bordered on reverence, opened it slowly like the paper inside might dissolve if she moved too fast. Photographs first. A younger Emmett Calloway dressed in fatigues that dated the image to a different era entirely, standing beside men whose names had been redacted with thick black lines, except for one. Nathaniel Thorne.
Younger, too, leaner, but the eyes were the same eyes Sloane had learned to fear in every whispered story she'd ever overheard about the man who now ran Thorne's Sentinel Group.
They were close, she murmured. Look at this.
A photograph of the two men laughing together, arms slung over each other's shoulders, the particular ease of men who trusted each other with their lives and had proven it more than once.
Whatever happened between them,
Voss said, happened after this. Sloane's finger traced the edge of the photograph without quite touching it, like she was afraid the paper might crumble under too much pressure. My mother has a version of this photograph, she said, smaller, faded. She kept it in a drawer for years before she finally put it away completely because looking at it hurt worse than not looking at it. A pause. She used to say my grandfather trusted Thorne more than he trusted his own brother. That's the part that makes this so hard to sit with. It wasn't a stranger who did this to him. It was the person he would have died for first. Maybe that's exactly why it worked, Voss said quietly. Betrayal only cuts that deep when it comes from somewhere you never thought to guard. She looked up at him, something raw moving behind her eyes. You sound like you know that from somewhere specific. Everyone in this line of work knows it from somewhere, Voss said. Some of us just don't talk about it. She held his gaze a moment longer, like she was deciding whether to push further, then let it go and turned back to the folder. Sloane flipped further. Found a mission report, most of it blacked out except for a single surviving line near the bottom of the page. Operation terminated due to unauthorized deviation from command directive. Colonel Calloway relieved of command pending review. Unauthorized deviation, she read aloud. That's it. That's the whole official story. 3 words hiding 15 years of my family thinking he died doing something wrong. Doesn't mean he did. No, she agreed. It doesn't. She kept reading. Found a second document. This one, a personnel transfer form dated 8 days after the mission report, authorizing the reassignment of certain classified assets and personnel files under Thorne's direct authority. He inherited everything, she said slowly. The second my grandfather was removed from command, Thorne inherited every asset, every contact, every classified relationship that unit had built over a decade. Her voice hardened. That's not a coincidence. That's a plan. A plan for what? I don't know yet. She closed the folder carefully, holding it against her chest like something fragile. But I know this much. Whatever my grandfather found out or refused to do or discovered about Thorne that Thorne couldn't afford to have discovered, it was valuable enough that removing him from command wasn't enough. They needed him gone completely. They needed the world to believe he was gone completely, she corrected, which isn't the same thing at all. They drove out to the farmhouse near the Idaho border 2 nights later, following the last thread Sloane's contact had managed to trace before going dark himself, a silence that worried her more than she said out loud. The house sat alone at the end of a gravel road, paint-peeling porch sagging under the weight of 20 winters nobody had bothered to repair. A single light burned in the kitchen window. "You're sure about this?" Voss said, hand resting near his weapon as they approached. "I'm sure the man inside knew my grandfather. Whether that makes him safe is a different question entirely." The man who opened the door was old, older than his voice on the phone had suggested. Spine bent from years Voss couldn't guess at, eyes sharp despite everything else time had taken from him. "Sloane Calloway," he said before she'd said a word. You look like your grandfather when he was angry. I feel like him too, most days. The old man's mouth twitched something close to a smile. Come in, both of you, quickly. Some doors don't stay safe to stand in for long. Inside, the house smelled of wood smoke and old books, shelves lining every wall, floor to ceiling. Most of them, military histories and field manuals from decades Voss only half recognized. A rifle hung above the mantel, cleaned and oiled, despite its owner's obvious age. The kind of maintenance that spoke to habits too deep to abandon even in retirement.
You still keep that thing loaded? Voss asked, nodding toward it. Every night, Rook said. Man doesn't survive what I survived by trusting the quiet too much. Inside over coffee, neither of them touched the old man, told them what he knew. His name was Ellery Wade Rook, though he'd gone by 3 others during the years he'd worked alongside Emmett Calloway, back when both of them still believed the uniform meant something simple. Your grandfather found something, Rook said. Near the end, a ledger, financial records tying Thorne's unit to weapons sales that never should have happened. Sales to people your grandfather considered enemies of everything he'd sworn to protect. And Thorne knew he'd found it. Thorne built his entire empire on the assumption nobody would ever find it, Rook said. Your grandfather threatened to bring it forward. Official channels, congressional testimony, if it came to that. His eyes darkened. Men like Thorne don't let threats like that reach a microphone. So they staged his death. They staged something, Rook said carefully. Whether it was death, I never had proof of, only rumor. A whisper, years later, that Emmett Calloway wasn't buried in Arlington at all, that he was somewhere else entirely. Kept, not killed. Sloane's hands went white-knuckled around her coffee cup. Kept where? I don't know exactly, but I know Thorne built that Montana compound 11 years ago on land that used to belong to a training facility your grandfather's own unit once used, back before any of this happened. Rook's voice dropped lower. Some ghosts don't like leaving the ground they died on, and some men don't like letting go of the leverage they're still sitting on. The room went silent, except for the ticking of an old clock somewhere down the hall. He's alive, Sloane whispered. He's been alive this whole time, under that mountain. I can't promise you that, Rook said gently. I can only tell you what I believe. And I believe Nathaniel Thorne has spent 15 years protecting a secret far too valuable to bury. Sloane sat very still, cup forgotten in her hands, and for a moment Voss watched something break open behind her eyes that she'd clearly been holding shut for years, brick by careful brick. Why didn't you come forward sooner? She said. Not accusing, just tired. So tired. Because I was afraid, Rook said, and there was no shame in the admission, only the plain weight of a truth he'd carried a long time. Thorne doesn't just bury secrets, Sloane. He buries the people who know them. I've watched 3 men who worked alongside your grandfather disappear over the years, one by one. Each time explained away as something ordinary. A car accident, a heart attack, a hunting trip that went wrong. His hands trembled faintly around his own cup. I told myself staying quiet was staying alive. I'm not proud of that math, but I understood it. And now you're sitting in my kitchen asking questions I've been waiting 15 years for someone brave enough to ask. His eyes glistened, old and wet with something that might have been grief or might have been relief, or both tangled together the way they so often were. Your grandfather was the finest man I ever served under. If there's a version of this story where he's still breathing somewhere, I would spend whatever years I have left helping you find him, even if it costs me everything staying quiet was supposed to protect. Sloane reached across the table and took his hand, old and spotted and shaking slightly, and held it the way you hold something you're afraid might not survive being held too tightly. Thank you, she said, for telling me. For not staying quiet anymore. Don't thank me yet, Rook said. Thank me if you find him. Until then, all I've given you is a reason to hope, and hope has a cruel habit of costing more than it promises.
They drove back through the dark in silence for the first 20 minutes, Sloane staring out the window the same way she had on the helicopter 3 nights before, thumb tracing slow circles against her palm.
"You don't have to say anything," Voss said finally. "I know. But you should know something too." He kept his eyes on the road, giving her the privacy of not being looked at while she found her footing again. "Whatever's under that mountain, whoever it turns out to be, you're not walking toward it alone this time." She turned to look at him. "You don't know that yet, Master Chief. You don't know what we're about to find, or what it's going to cost to get there." "No," he admitted, "I don't." "Then how can you promise that—" He thought about it. Really thought, the way he thought about things that mattered. "Because some promises," he said, "you make before you know the cost. Otherwise, they're not worth much at all." Sloane didn't answer that, but something in her shoulders eased just slightly, the same small give he'd seen once before in a spare office with a cot nobody had slept on. She turned back to the window, watching the dark shapes of fence posts blur past in the headlights, mile after mile of empty Montana road unspooling ahead of them like a question nobody had finished asking yet. 15 years, she said quietly, almost to herself. 15 years of birthdays, where my mother lit a candle for a man who might have still been breathing 30 miles from where we lit it. 15 years of Christmas mornings with an empty chair nobody was allowed to talk about. Her voice cracked just slightly, the first real crack Voss had heard in it since the concrete room. "If he's alive down there. If he's been alive this whole time, I don't know if I forgive the world for that or if I burn it down." "Maybe you don't have to choose yet," Voss said. "Maybe I don't have a choice." They drove in silence a while longer, the headlights carving twin tunnels through the dark before Sloane spoke again, quieter this time. "Can I ask you something, Master Chief?" "Go ahead." "Do you have family? Anyone waiting up for you on nights like this?" Voss kept his eyes on the road. "Had a wife, once. Didn't survive the deployments." A pause. "No kids. Just the team, most years. They're not nothing." "No," Sloane agreed. "They're not. You, just my mother now. And whatever's left of my grandfather, wherever he is." She looked out at the dark shapes of fence posts blurring past. "I used to think that made me lonely. Lately, I think it just makes me focused. Might be the same thing, wearing a nicer word." They drove the rest of the way back to base in silence, the kind of silence that wasn't empty so much as full, crowded with everything neither of them had the right words for yet. 2 nights later, at a bare stretch of landing strip 40 miles from the Montana border, the team gathered under cover of darkness to finalize the insertion that would carry them back through Thorne's fence line, this time, with a purpose far larger than a single rescue. Duran ran final equipment checks, hands steady despite the exhaustion carved into his face after 5 days without real sleep. Halverson and Reyna reviewed the compound's updated layout cross-referenced against new satellite passes that showed increased security since Sloane's disappearance 3 nights earlier. Cobb worked the comms gear, alone, at the edge of the strip, murmuring frequencies under his breath, and it was Cobb who noticed it first. A discrepancy in the flight manifest logged that morning. A route change nobody on the team had authorized, submitted through channels that should have required Voss's direct approval. Chief Cobb said, quiet enough that only Voss heard it at first. "You didn't file this change, did you?" Voss looked at the manifest on the screen, felt something cold slide down his spine. "No," he said, "I didn't. Because somebody had rerouted their approach, shifting the landing coordinates half a mile east of the plan they'd spent 2 days building, close enough to seem harmless, far enough to matter enormously if the wrong person happened to already know exactly where a helicopter wasn't supposed to be." Halverson came up beside them, reading the screen over Voss's shoulder, jaw tight. "That's not a clerical error. That's precise." "Precise how?" Duran asked, joining them now, gear half-checked and forgotten in his hands. "Precise like somebody wanted us to think it was harmless," Halverson said. "Half a mile's nothing on a map. It's everything on the ground if you know exactly where the tree cover thins out." Reyna's voice came low from where he still stood, watching the tree line. which means whoever did this knows this terrain almost as well as we do. Voss looked around the strip at his team, at Duran checking gear, at Halverson reviewing the layout, at Reyna, quiet as always, watching the tree line like he expected something to move out of it. Somewhere among them, or somewhere close enough to reach them, was the leak Sloane had warned them about 3 days ago in a room with old paper and older ghosts. And it had just made its first move. "Nobody boards," Voss said, voice low final. "Nobody boards until I know exactly who authorized this change, because somebody just told Thorne exactly where we're about to land." Sloane came up beside him, expression hardening, eyes scanning the same faces he'd just scanned, weighing each of them, the way she'd learned to weigh everyone since a lobby in Montana 3 weeks ago. "Not one of us," she said, low enough that only Voss heard it. "It has to be someone with access to the manifest system, someone outside this strip entirely." "That doesn't make it less dangerous." "No," she agreed. "It makes it worse, because it means whoever it is doesn't need to be standing here to hurt us." Voss keyed his radio voice flat and controlled despite the cold running through his chest. "Cobb, lock that manifest down. Nobody touches flight coordinates again without going through me directly, verbally. No digital trail." "Copy, Chief. And find out who had access to submit that change in the last 6 hours. I want a name before this aircraft moves an inch." The strip went quiet except for the tick of cooling engine metal and the distant hush of wind moving through grass nobody had cut in years. Somewhere out past the tree line, the mountains sat dark and patient, holding whatever truth still waited beneath them, indifferent to how many more nights it might take before someone finally walked close enough to pull it into the light. Sloane stood beside Voss in that darkness, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the same horizon he was watching steady despite everything the last week had cost her. And for the first time since the tarmac 3 nights ago, he heard something new in her voice when she finally spoke again. Not fear, not fury. Resolve, sharpened down to something almost calm. The kind of calm that only ever arrived after a person finally stopped running from a truth and turned to face it instead. "Find the leak, Master Chief," she said. "Because once we do, there's nothing left standing between me and that mountain, and I intend to walk through whatever's left of it until I find out exactly what my grandfather has been paying for all these years just to stay alive." The wind picked up across the strip, carrying with it the first cold breath of the mountain weather, rolling down off the Bitterroots, and Voss found himself thinking, not for the first time that week, that some debts really did wait 15 years, just to make sure the right person finally showed up to collect them. The name came back 40 minutes later, and it landed in the room like a dropped weapon. Not Cobb, not Duran, not anyone standing on that airstrip at all. A logistics officer 3 levels removed from the mission, someone who'd never set foot near Montana, someone whose access credentials had been quietly compromised months earlier and used exactly twice. Once to flag Sloane's cover identity for a routine audit sweep 3 weeks ago, and once tonight to shift a helicopter's landing coordinates half a mile east of where they needed to be. "He's not the leak," Sloane said, staring at the name on Cobb's screen. "He's a door somebody else walked through." Meaning whoever's really doing this is smart enough not to leave fingerprints of their own. Something hardened in her voice. "Which means we're not looking for a person who works inside this building. We're looking for someone who knows exactly how to move through it without ever being seen." Voss looked at the mountains beyond the tree line, dark and waiting patiently, the way mountains always were. "Then we stop looking," he said, "and we go get the truth ourselves. Because whoever's pulling strings from a distance can't stop what's about to happen 30 miles from here." Halverson crossed his arms, studying the tree line with the particular patience of a man who'd learned long ago that rushing a decision only guaranteed rushing a funeral. "You sure about this, Chief? Going in without knowing who's watching from the inside?" "No," Voss admitted. "I'm not sure of much right now, but I'm sure Thorne's men just proved they can reach us anywhere we plan from. Waiting doesn't make that safer. It just gives them more time to finish whatever cleanup they've already started." Duran shifted his weight, jaw tight. And if the leak tips them off again, mid-operation this time?
Then we adapt mid-operation, Voss said. Same as we've done every other time reality didn't cooperate with the plan. Sloane closed her eyes for a moment, breathing slow, the way she'd taught herself to breathe through fear a long time ago on a dock beside a different lake. 4 months, she said. 4 months building a cover. 3 weeks tied to a chair. 15 years my family spent grieving a man who might have been 30 miles away the whole time. Her eyes opened hard, now resolved. I am done letting distance and delay decide what happens next. Whatever's waiting inside that mountain, I'm walking in to meet it. Tonight, if you'll let me. Tomorrow, if I have to do it alone. You won't have to do it alone, Voss said. Not tonight, not tomorrow, not any night after that, as long as I have a say in it. She looked at him for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind her eyes, and then nodded once, the decision made. The fear folded down small enough to carry. Then let's go get him, she said. They inserted at 0200 4 days after the landing strip discovery, this time on foot, from 6 miles out. Engines cut early, boots hitting cold ground under a sky scraped clean of clouds. Sloane moved at the center of the formation now, not behind it. Voss had argued against that placement for exactly 4 minutes before giving up because arguing with her about her own risk tolerance had stopped working somewhere around the farmhouse in Idaho, and he'd finally understood that some fights weren't his to win. You good? He asked low as they crested the last ridge before the compound came into view. No, she said, but I'm ready. Those aren't the same thing, and I've stopped pretending they are. Below them, the compound sat exactly where satellite imagery had promised it would, fence line dark against pale grass guard towers spaced with the particular precision of men who understood exactly what they were protecting. More guards than 3 weeks ago, nearly double. They know we're coming, Duran murmured. They suspect, Sloane corrected. There's a difference. Suspicion means they've doubled patrols. Certainty means they'd have already moved whatever's inside that low building. You're betting a lot of lives on the difference between those two words. I've been betting my life on smaller differences for 4 months, Sloane said. This one, I trust. They moved the last mile in near silence, boots soft against frost-hardened ground, breath fogging pale in the cold before dawn. Voss counted his team the way he always did before a breach, running names through his head like a rosary. Halverson, steady as bedrock, Reyna, quiet and precise, Duran, young but proven, now 5 days of near sleeplessness behind him, and still moving like a man twice his experience. And Sloane, walking at the center of the formation with a rifle she'd already used once tonight to save a stranger's life from 400 yards. Cobb's voice crackled low in every earpiece at once. Confirmed. No new manifest changes. No unauthorized access in the last 6 hours. Whoever's watching, they're watching from somewhere we can't see yet. Copy, Voss said. Assume we're still being watched. Move like it. Because that was the only safe assumption left. Assume eyes on every ridgeline. Assume ears on every frequency. Assume the mountain itself had learned over 15 years of guarding its secret exactly how to listen for footsteps that didn't belong. Halverson fell into step beside Voss for a stretch, voice low enough that only he could hear it over the wind. You know what we're really walking into tonight, Chief? I have a guess. I've had this feeling exactly twice before in my career, Halverson said. Both times it turned out I was walking toward something that changed how I thought about the whole job afterward. Not the mission, the job. What it's actually for. And you think tonight's the third time? I think, Halverson said, that a man's been kept alive under a mountain for 15 years because somebody decided his knowledge mattered more than his freedom. I think whatever we find in there is going to sit with all of us a long time after tonight's over. Voss didn't argue with that. Some instincts in this line of work earned themselves the right not to be argued with. The compound's fence line rose out of the pre-dawn gray exactly where satellite imagery had promised, and this time there was no pretending it belonged to anything as innocent as a corporate retreat. The breach came fast, Once it came the way breaches always did after hours of patient waiting collapsed suddenly into seconds of pure motion. Halverson took the east gate, Reyna and Duran the south fence line where the tree cover ran thickest. Voss and Sloane moved center toward the low, windowless building that had haunted every plan they'd built since the night they first pulled her out of that chair. Gunfire opened up within 90 seconds. Not from their team. From guards, who'd finally spotted movement along the fence, shouting into radios, muzzle flashes strobing yellow-white against the dark.
Contact left, Reyna's voice, tight over comms. 2 down, more coming. Copy, hold the line. Halverson's voice crackled in next steady despite the chaos. East gate secure, taking fire from the guard tower. Need eyes on that position. Reyna, can you get an angle? Negative, Chief. Tree line's too thick from here. Duran's breathing came hard over the comms, punctuated by the crack of his own rifle. I've got partial visual, can't confirm a clean shot. Voss felt the old familiar tightening in his chest, the sensation of a plan fraying at its edges the way plans always did the moment reality got involved. 4 operators, 1 exhausted intelligence officer, and a compound holding more guns than they'd accounted for in every satellite pass they'd run. Halverson's voice again, rougher now, breathing hard between words. Chief, we're pinned. Whatever you've got, I need it in the next 30 seconds or I'm pulling back to the tree line. 30 seconds, Voss said. Copy. Sloane dropped low beside Voss behind a fuel drum, breathing controlled despite the chaos erupting around them, eyes scanning for angles the way her grandfather had taught her to scan a room since she was 11 years old, on a dock at first light. There, she said, pointing. Rooftop, northeast corner. Voss followed her finger. A shape, barely visible, prone against the roofline of the main building, rifle settling into position. Sniper, he said. Not just any sniper. Her voice went flat, professional, the voice of someone who'd studied every photograph in that archive folder until the details lived permanently behind her eyes. That's Thorne's personal security. I recognized his posture from a training video I found on an internal drive. He's good. He's very good. How good? Good enough that if he gets a clean shot on Halverson's position, we lose our east flank in about 4 seconds. Voss looked at the angle, looked at his own rifle, looked at the 400 yards of open, uneven ground between their position and a shot that difficult. I can't make that shot from here, he admitted. Not clean, not in time. Sloane was already moving, sliding into position beside the fuel drum, rifle coming up to her shoulder with a fluid economy of motion that told Voss everything he needed to know about every hour her grandfather had ever spent correcting her stance on that dock. I can, she said. Wind 6 miles per hour crossing left to right, elevation drop across 400 yards, subtle but real, her own pulse hammering hard enough that she had to count it down. Had to find the gap between heartbeats where the world went still enough to trust. Breathe out halfway, hold it there. Her grandfather's voice, 15 years worn into memory and closer now than it had been in longer than she could remember, steady in her mind, the way it had been steady on 100 mornings she'd spent learning this exact stillness. She could almost feel his hand adjusting her elbow, almost hear the particular patience in his voice that never once in all those childhood mornings sounded like frustration, no matter how many times she got the angle wrong. Not all the way empty, Sloane, halfway. The rooftop shape-shifted, settling deeper into position, rifle swinging slowly toward Halverson's exposed flank. She had 1 shot. Maybe 2 if the world was generous, which it rarely was. Her finger found the trigger, found the space between heartbeats, found the halfway breath her grandfather had spent a childhood teaching her to trust, and squeezed. The shape on the rooftop went still, then folded, then dropped from view entirely, and for 1 suspended half-second, the entire compound seemed to hold its breath along with her. Target down, she said, voice steady despite the tremor running through her hands the second the shot cleared. East flank is clear. Voss stared at her, at the rifle still settled against her shoulder, at the particular calm that had come over her in the 4 seconds it took to end a threat from 400 yards away. That was not a possible shot, he said. My grandfather always said impossible was just a word people used for shots they hadn't practiced enough. she said, already rising, already moving toward the building ahead of them. "Come on, we're not done." Halverson's voice came back over comms a moment later, rougher than usual, something close to disbelief threading through it. "Whoever just made that shot, remind me never to make her angry."
"Copy that," Durand said, breathless, half a laugh buried somewhere in the exhaustion.
"East flank's folding. Guards are falling back toward the central compound. Looks like they just lost whatever nerve they had left." "Keep pressing," Voss said. "Don't let them regroup." The fighting thinned rapidly after that, guards abandoning positions one by one as word spread through whatever remained of their radio chatter that the compound's defenses were collapsing faster than anyone had planned for. They breached the low building's outer door 12 minutes later, resistance thinning as Halverson's team folded the east flank inward and Reyna's team pressed the south fence line hard enough that Thorne's remaining guards had started falling back toward the central compound instead of holding perimeter. Inside the building was larger than it had looked from outside. A false front, Voss realized immediately, concrete corridors running deeper into the mountainside than the visible structure suggested, stairwells descending into a lower level that hadn't shown up on any satellite pass they'd ever pulled.
"This isn't a building," Sloane said, voice tight. "It's an entrance."
They found Nathaniel Thorne in a command room 3 levels down, standing calm behind a bank of monitors, hands folded in front of him like a man who'd expected this exact moment for 15 years and had made his peace with however it turned out. "Sloane Calloway," he said before either of them spoke.
"You look remarkably like your grandfather when he was about to do something he believed in more than his own safety."
"I've been told that."
"By whom?"
"By someone who thought it was a compliment." Thorne almost smiled. Almost the way Sloane herself almost smiled, and Voss watched something pass between the two of them that felt older and more complicated than a simple confrontation between hunter and prey.
"You found your way here," Thorne said. "I confess I underestimated how far you'd go."
"You underestimated a lot of things," Sloane said. 15 years of underestimating, actually. Starting with whatever you thought you could bury and keep buried forever.
"Everything gets found eventually," Thorne said. "I always knew that. I simply hoped I would be an old man in a different sort of chair by the time it happened." "You are an old man," Sloane said. "You just don't get to choose the chair anymore."
Something flickered across Thorne's face at that, something that might have been the closest thing to fear he'd allowed himself in 15 years of building an empire meant to keep fear at bay entirely. Voss watched Thorne's remaining men at the edges of the room, weapons lowered but not holstered, waiting for some signal about which way loyalty was about to break.
"Stand down," Thorne said to them quietly, without looking away from Sloane. "Whatever happens here, it doesn't need your help anymore."
The older one hesitated only a moment before lowering his weapon fully and stepping back toward the wall. The younger one followed, some last piece of the compound's authority finally visibly dissolving in real time. "May I ask you something?" he said, "before whatever happens next happens."
"You can ask." "Do you hate me?" Sloane considered the question with a stillness that unsettled Voss more than any answer could have. She let it sit there, in the space between them, weighing it the way her grandfather had taught her to weigh everything that mattered. "I don't know yet," she said finally. "I think hate takes more energy than I have left for you. Right now, I mostly just want the truth. Hate can come later if it wants to." "Tell me what happened to him," Sloane said. Her rifle stayed level steady despite everything trembling underneath the surface of her voice. "Tell me the truth, not the file, not the redacted lines, the truth." Thorne studied her for a long moment, and something shifted behind his eyes, something that looked for the first time since they'd walked into that room almost like grief. "Your grandfather found something he wasn't meant to find," he said. "Weapons transfers I authorized to groups I believed at the time were the lesser evil in a war nobody back home understood the shape of. He disagreed. Violently. Morally. He was going to bring it to Congress." "So you killed him?" "No," Thorne said, sharp enough to cut through the room. "I have never once in 15 years been able to kill him.
I tried to reason with him. I tried to buy his silence. When both failed, I made a choice I have regretted every single day since, and I want you to understand before anything else happens in this room that regret does not mean I believe I had another option.
There's always another option. Not always, Thorne said, quieter now. Sometimes there's only the choice between two wrongs, and you spend the rest of your life arguing with yourself about which one cost less. Voss watched Sloane's hands steady on the rifle and understood that whatever came next in this room would define more than just the next 30 seconds. It would define who she decided to become on the other side of all of this. "Where is he?" she said. Not a question anymore, a demand that left no room for anything except an answer. Thorne's eyes closed briefly. "Down the corridor," he said. "Third door. He's been there 15 years, Sloane. Alive because I needed the cipher key only his memory could provide. The key that unlocks every name on every list I've spent 15 years protecting." A breath heavy with something that might have been relief at finally saying it out loud. "I kept him alive because I needed him. I am not proud of that, but I am telling you the truth because you've earned it and because I am tired of carrying a secret this heavy alone." The third door down the corridor was reinforced steel biometric lock, glowing faint blue in the dim hallway light, and Sloane's hands shook as she raised them toward the panel Thorne had unlocked, with a resigned nod toward one of his own men. The door slid open. The room inside was small, clean, better kept than the compound's exterior had suggested. A narrow bed, a single chair, a window looking out onto nothing but reinforced concrete painted to resemble a horizon that didn't exist. And in the chair, an old man, thinner than any photograph had shown him, hair fully silver now, face carved deep with 15 years. No family had been allowed to witness. But his eyes, when they lifted toward the door, were exactly the eyes Sloane had grown up seeing in faded photographs kept in a drawer nobody opened anymore. "Sloane," he said, and his voice cracked around her name like it had been waiting 15 years to be used again. "Sloane, is that really you?" She crossed the room in 3 steps and dropped to her knees in front of him, taking his hands in both of hers hands. So much older and thinner than the ones that had corrected her grip on a rifle stock 15 years ago on a dock at first light. "I'm here," she said, voice breaking apart completely for the first time since a concrete room 3 weeks ago. "Grandpa, I'm here. I found you." "I never stopped believing someone would," he whispered. "I told myself every single day that if anyone in this world was stubborn enough to keep looking, it would be you." His hands trembled in hers, not from weakness alone, but from something closer to disbelief, as though 15 years of solitude had taught his body it could no longer trust the evidence in front of it. "Your mother," he said. "Is she?" "She's alive. She's waiting. She doesn't know yet, Grandpa. Nobody knows yet except the people in this room." "Good," he said, and something fierce moved behind his tired eyes. A flicker of the man he must have been before 15 years wore him down to this smaller, quieter version. "Good. Let me be the one to tell her myself. I've imagined that conversation every single day since they put me in this room. I'd like to finally have it." Sloane laughed, wet and broken and joyful all at once, the sound of someone who hadn't let herself laugh freely in longer than she could remember. "You'll have it," she said. "I promise." He studied her face, then really studied it, the way a man studies something he's afraid might disappear if he looks away too soon. "You look like her," he said. "Your mother, when she was young and furious at the world for not moving fast enough." A weak smile. "You look like me too, I think. God help you." "I'll take both," Sloane said. "I'll take anything that means I found you." For a long moment, neither of them said anything else, just held on her head bowed against his knee, the way she must have done as a small child, his hand resting weak but certain against her hair. And Voss stood in the doorway and let them have that moment without interruption, because some things deserve to happen at their own pace, regardless of the clock ticking somewhere above them. They didn't have long.
Voss knew that, even as he stood in the doorway watching a reunion 15 years in the making unfold in a room built to hide it forever, because somewhere above them, Thorne's remaining men were regrouping, and somewhere in that regrouping was a decision about to be made that would determine whether anyone walked out of this mountain alive.
Sloane, his voice gentle but firm, we need to move. Now. She nodded, wiping her face with the back of one hand, helping her grandfather rise from the chair with a tenderness that made something ache deep in Voss's chest, a feeling he didn't have time to name. Emmett Calloway was weaker than 15 years should have made a man that strong, but he stood. And when Voss offered a shoulder to lean on, he took it, without pride getting in the way, because pride apparently was something 15 years in a locked room had taught him to set aside when survival required it. "Thank you," the old man said, quietly, as they moved him down the corridor, "for bringing her here, for not letting her come alone."
She wasn't going to let anyone else make that choice for her, Voss said. Emmett almost laughed, weak but real. "No, she wouldn't. That's my fault entirely." They moved slowly, the old man's steps uncertain on legs that hadn't carried real weight across real distance in longer than he could remember, and twice he had to stop, breathing hard, apologizing each time in a voice that carried more shame than the situation warranted.
"Don't," Sloane said gently the second time. "Don't you dare apologize to me for surviving 15 years in a locked room. You did the hardest thing a person can do. You stayed alive long enough to be found." "I stayed alive because I hoped," Emmett said. "Hope is easy to romanticize when you're not the one sitting alone with it for 15 years wondering if it's foolish or if it's faith."
"Which was it?" Sloane asked.
Her grandfather considered the question with the same careful weight she'd inherited from him, without ever fully realizing where it came from. "Both," he said finally. "I think most worthwhile things are." They reached a landing where the corridor widened, and Emmett paused, one hand braced against the cold concrete wall, breathing hard but steady. "Can I tell you something?" he said, "before we're back among people who'll want reports and statements and all the formal weight of what just happened." "Of course." "I never once in 15 years imagined it would be you who came for me. I imagined your mother sometimes. I imagined old friends from the unit, men who owed me favors. I never let myself imagine a granddaughter I'd only known for 11 years before all this happened, grown into someone capable of walking through a locked door with a rifle and enough stubbornness to outlast an empire." His voice caught. "I'm sorry I missed so much of who you became. I'm grateful, more than I know how to say, that who you became was exactly enough to find me." Sloane's eyes filled, and she didn't bother wiping them this time. "You didn't miss it," she said. "You're the reason for all of it. Every single part of who I am walked into that room tonight because of what you taught me on a dock I still dream about." They stood there a moment longer before continuing down the corridor, the weight of 15 years finally beginning slowly to lift. They found Thorne waiting at the top of the stairwell, alone now, his remaining men either fallen back or fled entirely once word spread that the compound's lower levels had been breached. He didn't raise a weapon, didn't move to stop them. "I imagine," he said, "you have a decision to make about me now." Sloane stopped her grandfather's weight steady against her shoulder and looked at the man who had stolen 15 years from both of them. "I do," she said. "And," her finger rested near the trigger guard, not on it, a distinction Voss noticed immediately and understood the weight of completely. Behind her, he could hear Halverson and Duran approaching from the corridor, weapons still raised, waiting for whatever call she was about to make. "There's a list," she said. "Names, people whose lives depend on that list never reaching the people you sold weapons to. I need that list, and I need it from someone who's still breathing enough to explain every entry on it truthfully in front of a courtroom." "You're choosing to let me live. I'm choosing to let justice have you," Sloane said, voice hard as stone now, "instead of letting you become one more convenient death nobody ever properly explained. My grandfather spent 15 years alive because you needed something from him.
Now you're going to spend the rest of your life explaining in detail in public exactly what that something was and exactly who else it hurt along the way." Thorne's shoulders sagged, some final resistance draining out of him all at once. "That's a harder sentence than a bullet," he said quietly. "Good," Sloane said. "It's supposed to be." She held his gaze a moment longer, and something passed between them that Voss couldn't quite name, something that lived somewhere between contempt and a strange, exhausted mercy. "For what it's worth," Thorne said, "I am glad it was you who found him. Whatever else I've done, whatever else I deserve, I never once doubted that if anyone was going to walk through that door, it would be a Calloway." "Don't," Sloane said, voice tight. "Don't try to make this into something softer than it is. You don't get absolution from me. You get a courtroom and a judge and every single family whose names ended up on your list finally learning what you cost them." Thorne nodded once, slow, accepting the weight of that without argument. "There," he said. "More than fair." He let out a long breath, the sound of a man setting down a weight he'd carried alone for far too long, and for just a moment, standing in that corridor with cuffs waiting and an empire collapsing around him, Nathaniel Thorne looked almost relieved. The extraction that followed was almost anticlimactic after everything that came before it. 4 SEALs and 1 exhausted intelligence officer, walking a 15-year ghost out through a compound finally emptied of the men who'd guarded his silence for so long. Federal agents arrived within the hour, summoned the moment Cobb's comms confirmed the compound secure, and for a while, the mountain that had held its secret for 15 years filled instead with the ordinary noise of an operation winding down, radios crackling, boots on gravel, the particular efficient calm of professionals doing paperwork after violence. Nathaniel Thorne walked out in cuffs, flanked by Halverson and Duran, his empire collapsing behind him, one classified document at a time. Emmett Calloway rode out on a stretcher he insisted weakly but firmly he did not need, holding his granddaughter's hand the entire way down the mountain. Both of them silent, both of them, finally allowed to simply exist in each other's presence without 15 years of grief standing between them. Reyna walked beside the stretcher the whole way down, saying nothing, but positioning himself so that his body blocked the worst of the wind coming off the ridge. A small, unasked-for kindness that Sloane noticed and never forgot to mention afterward whenever the story came up among people who'd earned the right to hear it. The hospital in Missoula kept Emmett Calloway for 11 days, long enough for doctors to marvel more than once at how a man could emerge from 15 years of captivity with as much of his mind intact as he had. Long enough for federal investigators to begin the slow work of untangling Thorne Sentinel Group's finances, its contracts, its 15 years of carefully laundered weapons transfers now spilling out into daylight, one document at a time. Sloane barely left his bedside those first few days, sleeping in a chair pulled close enough that she could hear him breathing, waking at every small sound like she still expected the world to try taking him away from her a second time. Halverson and Duran stopped by once, awkward in the way big men often were in hospital rooms, standing near the door, like they weren't sure they'd earned the right to sit closer. Emmett insisted they come in anyway, asked Duran about his family, asked Halverson how many years he had left before the Navy finally let him rest, and by the time they left, both men looked lighter than they had walking in. The particular relief of meeting a legend and finding him kinder than the stories had suggested. Voss visited twice. The first time Emmett was asleep and Sloane sat in the hallway outside his room, exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical tiredness and everything to do with the particular weight of finally being allowed to stop fighting. "You should sleep," Voss said, "somewhere that isn't a hospital chair." "I will, eventually." "That's what you said about the extraction." She almost laughed. "Fair." The second visit, Emmett was awake, sitting up in bed with more color in his face than the first time, and he looked at Voss with the particular sharpness of a man taking someone's measure, the way only old soldiers ever really learned to do. "Master Chief," he said, "I understand you're the one who found her first?" "In that room." "I am. And you believed her when she gave you that signal instead of screaming for help."
I did. Emmett nodded slowly, something satisfied settling into his tired features. Good instincts. She'd have had a hard time explaining herself to someone slower on the uptake. She didn't need to explain much, Voss said. The signal did most of the talking. That's my training, Emmett said, and something proud flickered behind the exhaustion in his eyes. Every bit of it. I used to tell her the world doesn't always give you words when you need them most. Sometimes all you get is a gesture, and you'd better make it count. She used it well, Voss said. Better than well. It's the reason any of us knew to trust her instead of just cutting her loose and moving on. Emmett's eyes glistened just slightly. Then I taught her exactly what she needed, and not a moment too soon. That's more than most grandfathers get to say about their lessons. Sloane, listening from the doorway, said nothing, but something in her face told Voss she'd heard that lesson 100 times growing up, and was only now understanding fully exactly how much it had saved her life. The federal case against Thorne moved fast once the list surfaced, faster than anyone expected, given the 15 years of careful concealment behind it. Names that had sat exposed and vulnerable for over a decade were quietly, methodically secured. Families who'd never known how close danger had come were never told the details, only that a threat once circling them had finally, permanently been closed. Whitfield called Voss into his office one final time before the case moved fully into civilian hands, and for once, his face carried something closer to relief than weight. "You did good work, Chief," he said. "All of you." "She did most of it." "I'm aware," Whitfield said, and something almost like a smile crossed his face. "Which is precisely why Naval Intelligence has already put in a formal request to keep working with her. Assuming she wants anything more to do with any of us after everything this cost her." "And the leak," Voss said. "The logistics officer whose credentials got used. What happens to him?" "Cleared," Whitfield said. "Compromised, not complicit. We found the real access point 2 days ago, a contractor with ties going back further than anyone wanted to admit. That part of the story isn't finished yet, but it's finally moving in the right direction." Voss thought about that for a moment. Thought about the woman who'd walked out of a lobby in Montana 3 weeks before that first extraction with a fabricated name and a stone-set determination that had somehow survived 3 weeks tied to a chair without breaking. "She'll want more," he said. "That's not a woman who stops once she's found the truth. That's a woman who's just getting started." Whitfield studied him a moment. "And you, Chief? You planning on being part of whatever comes next?" Voss hadn't thought about it in those terms before, but the answer arrived without hesitation, the way true answers sometimes did. "If she'll have the team," he said. "Yes, somebody needs to keep an eye on all that stubbornness. Might as well be people who already understand exactly what it's worth." 6 weeks later, Voss drove up a gravel road he'd never expected to see again toward a cabin sitting quiet beside a lake in western Montana, mist rising soft off gray water in the early morning light. The drive up had given him time to think, which he hadn't entirely wanted. Time to remember a concrete room and an unlocked door, a helicopter cabin where a woman's lips moved silently around words meant only for herself, a rooftop shot from 400 yards that shouldn't have been possible and somehow was anyway. 6 weeks of federal proceedings of Thorne's empire unraveling one classified document at a time, of names on a recovered list finally being quietly, carefully protected instead of sold. 6 weeks of a story that had started as a simple rescue and ended up rewriting everything he thought he understood about courage. Sloane was on the dock when he arrived, rifle in hand, though this time the target was nothing more dangerous than a floating can 50 yards out, and beside her, seated in a chair someone had carried down from the porch, Emmett Calloway watched with the patient attention of a man who had spent 15 years starved of exactly this kind of ordinary morning. "Elbow down!" the old man called out, voice stronger now than it had been in that locked room. "Not locked. Never locked." "I know, Grandpa." "Then why is it locked?" Sloane laughed, adjusting her stance, and the shot that followed clipped the can clean off the water's surface, sending it spinning up into the morning light. Voss stood at the edge of the dock a moment, watching them before either of them noticed he'd arrived. There was something in the scene that felt almost unbearably fragile. The kind of ordinary moment that only revealed its full weight once you understood everything it had cost to earn. "Master Chief," Emmett said finally, turning in his chair, eyes sharp despite everything 15 years had taken from him. "I hear I owe you a great deal." "You don't owe me anything, sir. Your granddaughter did most of the work herself." "That sounds exactly like something a man says right before a woman like her decides he's earned a cup of coffee anyway," Emmett said, and Sloane, setting down her rifle, actually smiled. Full and unguarded, the first smile Voss had seen from her that carried no weight behind it at all. "Coffee," she agreed. "Least I can do." They sat on the porch as the sun climbed higher over the water, Emmett dozing lightly in his chair after 20 minutes, worn out by a morning that would have exhausted him less badly a year from now, once strength returned the way doctors promised it eventually would. Sloane watched her grandfather sleep, then turned to Voss, something quieter settling behind her eyes now that the fight was finally, truly over. "Thank you," she said, "for that night in the concrete room. For not treating me like a hostage even after everything pointed toward that conclusion." "You made it easy," Voss said. "You never once acted like one." "I couldn't afford to." "No," he agreed. "I don't suppose you could." They sat in comfortable silence a while, the kind that didn't need filling, the kind two people only earned after walking through something together that neither of them would ever fully explain to anyone who hadn't been there. "How's your mother?" Voss asked eventually. Something soft moved across Sloane's face. "She cried for an hour straight the first time she saw him. Then she yelled at him for an hour after that for not finding some way to send word sooner, even though we both know there was no way he could have." A small laugh. "Then she made him his favorite dinner and sat up with him until 3 in the morning, just talking." I think that's how grief works, when it turns out to have been wrong the whole time. You don't just feel relief, you feel everything, all at once, in whatever order it wants to arrive. "That sounds about right," Voss said. "What about you?" Sloane asked. "Does it ever get easier, carrying what you carry, doing what you do?" Voss considered the question honestly, the way he considered most things that mattered. "No," he said. "Not easier. Different, maybe. You learn which weights are worth carrying and which ones you can finally set down. This one." He nodded toward the porch, toward the old man sleeping peacefully in his chair, toward the whole impossible arc of the last 2 months. "This one I don't mind carrying at all." Sloane looked at him for a long moment, something warm and grateful passing behind her eyes. "My grandfather always said the measure of a soldier isn't how many fights he wins," she said. "It's who he chooses to stand beside while he's winning them." "Sounds like a wise man." "He is," she said, present tense, no hesitation left in the word at all now. "He absolutely is." They sat in silence a while longer, the sun climbing higher, the lake settling into the particular stillness of a Montana morning that had earned its peace the hard way. "Do you ever wonder," Sloane asked, "whether it was worth it?" "Everything it cost to get here." Voss considered the question the way he considered most things that mattered to him now, slow and careful. "I used to measure missions by what they cost," he said. "These days, I've started measuring them by what they saved instead. Your grandfather breathing in that chair back there, that's not a cost. That's the whole point." Sloane looked at him for a long moment, something grateful settling behind her eyes. "There are others," she said, eventually quiet. "Other names on Thorne's list. Other operations he touched over the years. Other people who might still be sitting in rooms like the one my grandfather was in, waiting for someone stubborn enough to keep looking." Voss looked out over the lake, at the mist finally burning off the water under a sky going wide and blue and endless. "Then we'll go looking," he said, "when you're ready." "I'm ready now." "I know," he said, and something in his voice carried the particular warmth of a man who had learned, over the course of one impossible mission, that some people were simply built to keep walking toward the truth, no matter how many mountains stood between them and it. But your grandfather just fell asleep in that chair for the first time in 15 years without anyone standing guard over him. Let him have this morning first. Sloane looked at a grandfather breathing slow and even in the morning light safe, for the first time in longer than either of them could properly measure. "Okay," she said softly. "This morning first." The lake stretched out before them, calm and silver under the climbing sun, and somewhere beyond the tree line the rest of the world kept turning unaware that a debt 15 years old had finally, quietly come due. And somewhere further out still, past the mountains, past the fence lines and the locked rooms and the names on lists nobody had been meant to find there, were other doors waiting to be opened, other families waiting for someone stubborn enough to keep looking. But that morning on that dock, none of that mattered yet. There was only the lake, the sun, an old man sleeping peacefully in a chair, and a young woman finally allowed to simply sit still beside people who understood exactly what it had cost her to get here. Somewhere down the shoreline, a loon called, once long and low across the water, and Voss found himself thinking that some mornings didn't need anything more than that to feel complete. Not victory, not resolution, just a lake, a sleeping old man, and the quiet certainty that whatever else the world still owed this family, it had at least finally paid back the one debt that mattered most.